It began with a letter, unsigned, unsettling, and soaked in the perfume of legacy gone sour. A wealthy family's name was crumbling, one heir at a time, under the weight of old secrets and a poisoner's careful hand. What followed was a trail of impersonation, obsession, and the quiet art of murder dressed in civility. Somewhere between the orchids and the wine, the truth waited, bitter and deliberate. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. There are few things in this world that will stop me mid-stride on a Tuesday morning, but the sight of a man collapsing face first onto the steps of the Oxford Club, dressed like he was heading to tea with the Queen, happened to be one of them. I'd been admiring a pair of Oxfords in the window, not the club, the shoes, when the fellow in question executed a surprisingly graceful descent. He didn't flail, didn't grunt, didn't so much as disturb the pleat of his trousers. One moment he was standing, arm neatly looped through the crook of a rolled umbrella, and the next he was horizontal, with the umbrella still tucked under his arm like a particularly loyal valet. The doorman, a walrus-shaped man with more brass buttons than emotional range, muttered something about the heat. It was 58 degrees and overcast. A woman passing by gasped, but no one screamed. You don't scream in front of the Oxford Club, not even when someone dies on the steps. I leaned against the iron fence and gave it half a minute. Nothing moved. Not the man, not the umbrella, not even the doorman. So I stepped closer, just enough to confirm that yes, the gentleman was indeed quite dead, and yes, he had managed to die with the kind of dignity I've seen missing from more than one wedding. There was no sign of violence, no blood, no dramatic clenching of the chest or reaching toward heaven. Just a dead man who had apparently passed into the beyond while keeping his chin level and his cuffs even. The members of the Oxford Club began to collect at the windows like opera patrons watching a particularly slow overture. A few emerged, all tweed and restraint, forming a polite semicircle around the body, as if expecting it to deliver an after-dinner speech. One muttered, "Stroke, perhaps," while another countered, "Apoplexy." The oldest among them offered, with a surprising hint of relish, it was poison. It always is. I didn't argue, I just noted that his umbrella, still in place beneath the crook of his arm, hadn't budged. That told me more than they did. A man who keels over with no struggle, no twitch, and no attempt to cry for help doesn't usually get there by natural causes. That kind of silence is administered, not earned. Still I waited for the official cavalry. You don't go poking at a dead man in front of the Oxford set unless you want to spend the rest of your day being quoted by people who wear ascots indoors. The name came from a lean man with the posture of a yardstick and the attitude of a head butler on salary. He stepped forward with quiet authority, knelt beside the corpse and peered down like he was inspecting a misplaced canapé. "Reginald Moxley," he said. "Temporary member, English, arrived 6 weeks ago." There was a small murmur from the cluster of gentlemen. Apparently the English were always either dying or making themselves difficult, and this was the sort of behaviour they'd come to expect. "Did he have family?" I asked. The butler blinked at me as though I'd asked if Mr. Moxley liked jazz. "A niece, I believe. No local residence on file. Mr. Moxley was private." Private in this case meant unknown, unliked, or unprofitable. I couldn't tell which. But the man was clearly someone who had worn expensive suits, drank expensive gin, and made the kind of enemies who don't yell. The doorman reappeared with a phone and a face full of concern. "Ambulance?" "Police," I corrected him. "And maybe a priest, though I doubt he'll need both." I stood back, hands in pockets. The man had died without drama. That didn't mean there wouldn't be some before the day was over. 20 minutes later, Inspector Kramer arrived looking as cheerful as a man being handed a live snake. He stepped out of the police car, adjusted his hat with surgical precision, and scowled at the building as if it personally owed him an apology. "Goodwin," he barked, spotting me like a wart on a dinner plate. "Kramer," I said. You just missed the matinee." He gave me a look that could have melted lead and turned toward the body, where the uniformed officers were already doing their careful nothing. One took notes, another took photos. Kramer took control. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "Window shopping." The man collapsed. "I happened to be present." "You always happen to be present." He squatted beside the corpse, muttered something about the man being too stiff for a fresh kill, and rose with a grunt. "What do you know?" "Name's Reginald Moxley, British, temporary member, may or may not have had enemies, likely did." "Great," he said. "Another diplomat with a death wish." He didn't believe in accidents, not in clubs with walnut panels and imported gin. He didn't like the setting, didn't like the corpse, and most of all, didn't like seeing me standing there already half an hour into it. Kramer poked around long enough to grow annoyed. He didn't care for old clubs or older rules, and the Oxford Club had more of both than any sane man could catalogue. "The place stinks of port and powdered nonsense," he muttered. "You prefer rye and resentments," I offered. He turned. "What's your theory?" He didn't clutch anything, didn't cry out. "Umbrella never hit the ground. That looks like poison." "Everything looks like poison to you." "Not true. Some things look like money. Some look like marriage. This looked like a man who didn't know what hit him." He grunted, which in Cramerese meant he didn't disagree. The members were already back behind the glass, their interest spent. They'd seen their death for the season and would now retreat to brandy and oblivion. I gave the corpse a final glance, but it wasn't going to say anything, not until Wolfe had time to translate its silence. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was seated behind the dining table like a Roman emperor considering the fate of a lamb chop. He was halfway through a delicate trout and a bottle of Pouligny Montrachet, which meant conversation was forbidden unless you were Butter or Bernadette. Still, I had priority. I waited until Fritz retreated with the plates and said, "We've got a corpse at the Oxford Club." Wolfe didn't look up. "Your corpse, Mr. Goodwin?" "No, but I had front row seats." That earned me one flick of the eyes. I delivered the details. "Reginald Moxley, British, dead on the steps. No twitch, no struggle. Umbrella intact. Poison's my bet." "You're not a chemist," he said. "True, but I know the look of sudden death when it's well dressed." He dabbed his lips with his napkin, set down his glass and leaned back. "The Oxford Club," he murmured. "A silly name for a silly idea." "Kramer's on it," I said. And annoyed, but that's not news. Wolfe grunted. That wasn't news either. What was news was the way he tapped his finger on the table. Slow, deliberate, like someone rearranging puzzle pieces in the dark. Wolfe retreated to the office after lunch, claiming boredom and a desire for literature untainted by corpses. That was code for not wanting to admit he was intrigued. I watched from my desk as he opened a book on the history of inheritance law and didn't turn a page for 5 minutes. His left eyebrow, that famous semaphore of mental engagement, began to rise. Not high, just enough for me to file it under notable developments. "You're thinking," I said. "Don't be impertinent." "You only call me impertinent when I'm right." He closed the book. "You said Moxley had no known local kin?" "According to the butler, just a niece, somewhere." He grunted again. The eyebrows stayed aloft. In Wolfe's world, that was the sound of thunder forming, slowly, silently, behind the horizon. She rang the bell just after 7. I was halfway through organizing Wolfe's correspondence, which means I was skimming it for anything more interesting than quarterly wine offers, when I heard the chime. There was something about it, decisive but not loud, like someone who had rehearsed it. She stood on the stoop in a storm-colored coat, pale-faced, hands ungloved despite the chill. Not beautiful in the poster sense, but there was a kind of elegance in the way she held her spine, as if she'd spent years being watched and only recently started noticing it. "I'm Eleanor Moxley," she said. "I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe. It's urgent." I gave her the quick once-over, found no visible weaponry, and nodded her in. Urgent dead or urgent not yet? She hesitated. Not yet. That was a new one. I ushered her into the office. Wolfe was behind his desk, surrounded by the warm fog of his post-dinner reading. She introduced herself again, this time to him, with less steadiness. I believe my Uncle Reginald was murdered, she said. But that's not why I'm here. Wolfe's eyelids opened a hair wider. Oh, she swallowed. I think someone else is about to die. That was when Wolfe set the book aside and leaned forward. Not far, just enough. Mr. Wolfe, she said, I received a letter 3 days ago, anonymous. It said, your uncle will not see Sunday. I thought it was a prank. She reached into her bag, pulled out a folded slip of stationery, and laid it gently on Wolfe's desk. He didn't touch it. He never does, not until he's ready. But his gaze pinned it like a butterfly under glass. There's more, she continued. This evening after his death was in the news, I received another. Now that the first is done, the second must follow. I whistled quietly. Wolfe didn't blink. And you believe that second is you? She hesitated. Number, I believe it's my brother. Jeremy, he's not strong. Mentally? Wolfe asked. She nodded. Emotionally, he paints. He doesn't fight. Wolfe leaned back, hands forming a steeple. And you want me to prevent his death? Yes. Before a crime is committed? Yes. He closed his eyes for a beat. That, madam, is a rare and impractical request. He didn't say no, but he didn't say yes either. And from long experience, I knew that meant the machine had started turning. She placed the envelope on Wolfe's desk, the way you'd place a chess piece on the board when you're 3 moves from checkmate and trying not to shake. Cream stock, no return address, typed in black ink. The good kind, the kind that doesn't smudge unless your conscience is damp. Wolfe didn't reach for it. He merely stared as if its presence on his blotter were a philosophical affront. May I presume you've read it? He asked, without inflection. Eleanor Moxley nodded. 3 days ago. I picked it up, unfolded it, and read it aloud. Your uncle will not see Sunday. That was it. No signature, no demands, no postmark beyond Midtown. Just a statement. Calm, prophetic, and now accurate. Wolfe closed his eyes, not in reflection but resistance. You thought it a joke? I thought it cruel, she said. And anonymous cruelty is often cowardice, not intention. I glanced at her. She was speaking carefully, like a woman who knows the weight of every syllable. Wolfe, of course, ignored that and returned to staring at the note, as though it might yield a second sentence if stared at long enough. It didn't. But something in the stillness of that paper had already begun to disturb him. I received this one this morning, Eleanor said, reaching into her bag with the same deliberate care you'd use to retrieve a sleeping cat. She unfolded it and laid it beside the first, like placing a second body on the table. Same type, same tone, same anonymous chill. Now that the first is done, the second must follow. Wolfe exhaled, barely, and tilted his head. The second refers to my brother, she said. Jeremy? That earned her a half-second glance. Wolfe's gaze returned to the note. And this interpretation is based on what? Nothing tangible, just fear and context. Jeremy and I are the only 2 living relatives. Wolfe tapped a finger on the edge of the desk, twice. Assuming the notes are sincere, the first is done, and the second foretold. You believe Mr. Jeremy Moxley to be in present danger? Yes. I looked at Wolfe. He looked at the orchid by the window. You wish me to act on this, he said finally. Not as retribution for a completed crime, but in service of one yet to be committed. Yes, she said again. That kind of request, I knew, landed in Wolfe's conscience the way a cricket lands on a chessboard. Irregular, but hard to ignore. Tell me about your brother, Wolfe said, which in his vernacular was equivalent to unlocking the cellar and peering down the stairs. Eleanor drew a breath that had hesitation folded inside it. Jeremy is sensitive. That was the beginning of what turned into a well-composed portrait of a man best suited to art galleries, distant hills, and friendships with shadows. An Oxford-educated painter with a preference for solitude, a fear of loud rooms, and a tendency to vanish when expectations appeared. Reginald, she said, and here the word tightened, tolerated him, but he never believed Jeremy would carry the name. Which name? Wolfe asked. The Moxley name, she said. Reginald made it sound like a brand, not a family. It seemed Jeremy had been surviving beneath his uncle's granite expectations, living on allowance and anxiety, moving from studio to studio in a quiet attempt to not be noticed. And now, as luck or intention would have it, he was being noticed. Wolfe remained still, but I could see the architecture forming in his head, a structure built of personalities, inheritances, and one potentially disappearing heir. I regret, Wolfe said, not looking remotely regretful, that I cannot oblige you. Eleanor blinked. You mean you won't help? I mean precisely what I said, he replied, steepling his fingers. I do not traffic in speculation, premonition, or the emotional aftertaste of anonymous threats. I could tell she wanted to press further. She didn't. Wolfe went on. If someone has been murdered, the facts are ready for dissection. If someone is to be murdered, but has not yet, then we are chasing phantoms with nets. She stood. Even if the phantoms leave calling cards? Wolfe didn't answer. Not verbally. He simply closed his eyes and leaned back, which, in our house, is what you do when you've concluded a conversation. She turned to me. Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. I walked her to the door. She didn't fume, didn't plead. She simply left, with the same quiet control she'd arrived with. When I came back, Wolfe was paging through the plant index of a 1941 monograph on Tropaeolaceae. I waited. He didn't look up, but his left thumb was resting on the line that read Aconitum napellus. So maybe he wasn't entirely disinterested. I arrived at the Oxford Club with Eleanor's introduction and Wolfe's refusal tucked in my coat like twin pistols, though I wasn't planning to fire either. The place still had that padded hush, the kind you find in a bank vault or a chapel. Only here it came with whiskey breath and double-breasted discretion. The staff nodded as I entered, but the kind of nod that says we remember your shoes, not your name. I asked for the club secretary and was shown to a room with more books than readers, and windows overlooking nothing but respectable hedges. The men who drifted in and out, Eleanor's uncle's fellow gentlemen, all had that withered elegance, the kind that frays with age but never creases. They were polite, guarded, and practiced at it. I asked about Reginald Moxley. They responded with the kind of answers you get when someone's memory has been edited by reputation and port. No one claimed to know much. No one claimed to know little. It was a gallery of portraits, all expertly posed, none revealing their hands. So I poked around. And the shadows that flickered weren't from the lamps. It didn't take long for the key players to step out of the shadows or be nudged. Gerald Allerton was first, club vice-chairman, smooth as lacquered walnut and twice as polished. He shook my hand with the kind of smile that says, "You'll never see the real one." He called Moxley provocative in that damning way reserved for the dead. Dr. Alistair Finch arrived next, club physician, though he looked more like a character actor auditioning for the role. He sniffed powdered snuff every 10 minutes and deflected questions the same way, quickly, dryly, and with a faint English nasal drip. He claimed Moxley kept odd hours and occasionally forgot his tonic. And then there was Claire Renner. She was not what I expected. She wasn't mourning, wasn't deflecting. She was amused, poised in black silk and diamonds. She admitted to dining with Reginald a few times, but only smiled when I asked what she stood to inherit. "That depends," she said, "on whether you believe in sentiment or paperwork." I left her table with more questions than answers, and one subtle impression. Claire Renner had played with fire, and either she hadn't noticed or she'd been the one holding the match. They all had stories, but none of them had facts. Gerald Allerton spoke of friction between Moxley and a few members, but named no names. Dr. Finch murmured something about medication, then refused to clarify what kind, when, or why. Claire Renner leaned on innuendo like it was a chaise longue. The tone throughout was one of excessive civility, which in my book usually indicates someone's lying, or everyone is. The more questions I asked, the more carefully they avoided looking at each other. That's always telling. When people hide things separately, their lies form patterns. But when they lie together, well, then you're playing chess on a mirrored board. I left the Oxford Club not with clarity, but with shape. A trio of suspects whose politeness was almost rhythmic, the kind of rhythm that usually precedes a break. By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was late, and I was armed with nothing but the usual, fragments, names, and one or two choice instincts. I expected Wolfe to be in the office, pretending not to be curious. I was half right. He was there, pretending to read. I'd just opened my mouth when the phone rang. Fritz answered it. His face changed. "It's for Mr. Goodwin," he said, "about a missing person." That perked Wolfe up. I took the receiver. The voice was nervous, but not theatrical. "Jeremy Moxley," it said. "He didn't come home, left his studio unlocked. His landlady called me. I'm a friend." "Where?" I asked. "East 11th Street, apartment 3B. How long?" "Since yesterday." I hung up and looked at Wolfe. "Jeremy Moxley is missing." Wolfe didn't flinch. He merely tapped the desk once, and then again. I waited. He exhaled and said nothing, but the left eyebrow started to rise. That was enough. The silence stretched long enough to qualify as a statement. Then Wolfe, in a tone I'd heard perhaps 4 times in my life, said, "Not a figment." That was it. No exclamation, no flourish, just a 3-word admission that the facts had grown claws. I nodded. "Shall I call Miss Moxley?" He raised a hand indicating wait, or possibly endure. "We proceed," he said finally, "but not under compulsion." "I am not a guardian angel, Mr. Goodwin. I am a logician with an appetite." He leaned back, and with that the case became ours. Or rather, his. Convincing Nero Wolfe to take on a case still in the cradle is like convincing a glacier to pick up speed. Possible, maybe, but only if the climate's right and the slopes steep. The day after Eleanor's visit and Jeremy's vanishing act, I found him in the plant rooms, up to his knuckles in humid contentment, misting an orchid that apparently suffered from abandonment issues. I mentioned the name Moxley, Jeremy's absence, and the words second letter. Nothing. But when I added that the inheritance structure might encourage selective pruning of the family tree, and that Jeremy's landlady had found a half-packed suitcase and a painting turned face down in the hallway, he paused. Not long. Just long enough for me to know he'd moved from apathy to reluctant interest. "I suppose," he muttered, "if murder is to be treated as a chain rather than a singular event, then it demands interruption." I blinked. "Is that a yes?" "It is," he sighed. "An acknowledgement of necessity. You may proceed, with discretion." Which, coming from Wolfe, was practically a standing ovation. I took the hint and called a cab to the Oxford Club. The Oxford Club greeted me with the same air it always had, warm mahogany, middle-aged polish, and a faint smell of superiority baked into the drapes. I gave my name and business to a man whose eyebrows hadn't moved since 1937, and was ushered into a sitting room where even the silence wore cufflinks. I started with polite credentials and moved to impolite questions. Who had seen Reginald Moxley last? Who had access to his quarters? Who knew of any medical concerns? The answers came slowly, wrapped in varnished civility. Moxley had been seen in the lounge the night before, sipping port and ignoring Dr. Finch's advice about sugar. He had retired to his room. No one had heard anything unusual, no visitors were noted, no disturbances. The staff remembered nothing, the members remembered even less. I pressed, softly, then not. Every word came back muffled, as though the walls themselves had conspired to protect the club from scandal. The Oxford Club, I was reminded, had a policy of discretion, which, when translated, meant denial was cheaper than lawyers. Still, I left with a list of names and one impression. Someone had polished the truth with more care than the silver. You don't get very far in this line of work without learning to sniff out discomfort. The subtle shifts in tone, the hesitation before a name, the slight glances toward closed doors. Reginald Moxley had been, I learned through the cracks, a collector. Not of stamps, nor wine, nor paintings, but of leverage. The kind that comes folded in envelopes and stored behind lock and key. He'd been discreet, but not invisible. And the more I asked, the clearer it became. Moxley knew things, but about whom nobody would say. That silence had shape. It wasn't ignorance, it was protection. Not for Moxley, but from him. One man, a younger club member with a weak chin and stronger opinions, let slip that Moxley had been gathering notes, whatever that meant. Another muttered that he had kept a little black book, then promptly denied it existed. No one wanted to admit being blackmailed, but they were more than willing to agree that someone else probably had been. It was the kind of consensus that smells like fear. And fear, unlike port, doesn't pair well with respectability. The club members wore their manners like armor. Every answer I received was polished, balanced, and nutritionally void. The Oxford Club had trained them well. Respond without revealing, nod without admitting, sympathize without helping. I tried different angles. Did Moxley have enemies? Of course not, he was discreet. Was he planning any trips? Not that anyone knew, though he did enjoy quiet. Was he fond of writing letters? A chuckle here, a shrug there, and a gentle redirection to the club's literary section, which had more dust than volumes. Even when I tossed out words like inheritance, family trust, or beneficiaries, the effect was minimal. Eyes glazed, brows lifted faintly, and phrases like "not my place" and "surely a private matter" drifted into the room like pipe smoke. It was snobbery, used not for superiority but insulation. They had wrapped themselves in the ancient art of evasion, and their great strength lay in agreeing to nothing. Still, I caught something. A tightening of the jaw when Moxley's name was paired with the word documents. It was enough to scribble in my notebook, underlined. Sometimes evasion is louder than a scream. I was halfway back to the brownstone when I got the call. It came through Wolfe's private line, which Fritz answered with the wariness of a man expecting a bill collector. The voice on the other end belonged to Jeremy's landlady, nervous, confused, and half hysterical. Jeremy had been found, not dead, but certainly not painting either. He'd been discovered in a crumbling boarding house in Queens, slumped in a hallway chair, eyes half-lidded, pulse present but uninspired. A doctor had come. The verdict? Drugged, no sign of forced entry, no robbery, just a half-empty glass on a nightstand, the faint smell of bitter almond, and a young man who couldn't recall what day it was, let alone who might have wanted to erase it. I passed the details to Wolfe, who nodded slowly and said, "An experiment. A test of dosage or conscience. Either way, not lethal, yet." The "yet" wasn't theatrical. It was diagnostic. In Wolfe's mind, whoever had done this wasn't done doing it. And Jeremy Moxley, it seemed, had survived the first attempt, not because he was strong, but because someone had miscalculated. That kind of error doesn't usually happen twice. Jeremy, once coherent enough to speak, gave us something new, and something troubling. The day before his uncle's death, he'd received a formal summons from Reginald, a hand-delivered note requesting his presence for what was described as a matter of inheritance review. It sounded official, he said, blinking slowly, as if the words were emerging from fog. And final. He never made it to the meeting. Instead, someone else had made it to him, with a drink. Jeremy remembered little. A knock at the door, a bottle of cordial, allegedly from a friend. Then nothing, until the landlady's face hovered above him, followed by the blessed arrival of nausea and light. Wolfe, who had listened with eyes half-lidded, finally stirred. "If the meeting was intended to amend the will and the amendment favoured Jeremy," he said, "then its interruption was not random." He tapped his finger against his desk. Reginald may have died intestate, or his final intentions were never recorded. Either way, the inheritance and the motive had become a matter of timing, and someone, it seemed, had been watching the clock. By the time I returned from Queen's, Wolfe had already filled 2 pads with notes, cross-referenced 3 club rosters, and made Fritz fetch down a copy of the 1929 Moxley Family Trust from the file vault. The air smelled of ink and snuff, both fresh. I watched as he traced the lineage with a finger, lips pursed, muttering Latin like a man cursing wallpaper. Moxley, he said, had arranged for survivorship clauses. Meaning? Meaning, he said, that if one heir dies, their portion is not frozen, but absorbed. The fewer the heirs, the more concentrated the estate. I whistled softly. Elegant, Wolfe grunted. Murder often is. I poured myself a glass of water and made a note. Names circled on Wolfe's pad included Reginald, Jeremy, Eleanor, and faintly penciled a question mark beside Allerton. Sometimes the most interesting suspects don't inherit. They expect to. The call came just after 10. Kramer's voice, always a pleasure, sounded like gravel dragged across brass. "She's dead," he said. "Claire Renner, found in the tub." Wolfe leaned forward. "Details. Bathtub, bubbles, no struggle, same compound, alkaloid derivative, barely traceable. You happy?" Wolfe didn't answer. He reached for a sheet of paper and underlined something twice. I took the phone. "You're saying Claire Renner was poisoned?" "She was cleaned, perfumed, and prepared like a debutante," Kramer growled. "Except she won't be attending." "Any signs?" "None, just a trace of the same substance in her teacup." Wolfe, having heard, merely nodded. "Portion control," he said. "The killer is experimenting with restraint." "That's one word for it," I muttered. Kramer hung up. Wolfe stared at the wall for a full minute. Then he said, "We now have a pattern." He didn't say what kind, but in Wolfe's world, a pattern is the first confession. Kramer came in without knocking, which meant his mood had already skipped past polite and was warming up to hostile. He filled the room like a thunderhead in a doorway and announced, "You're staying out of this one, Wolfe. You hear me?" Wolfe, seated behind his desk like a seated Jupiter, lifted a brow. "Your ability to modulate volume, Inspector, has not improved." "I'm serious," Kramer snapped. 3 deaths, 1 club. I won't have you stirring the pot with your theories and theatrics." Wolfe closed his book and set it aside, a gesture that, in our establishment, carried the same weight as the signing of a treaty. "Then permit me to stir it with conversation." I knew that tone. That was Wolfe at his most irritatingly immovable. Before Kramer could erupt, Wolfe added, "You may conduct your investigation. I shall conduct mine." That, of course, was the exact opposite of staying out. By the time Kramer left, muttering obscenities like breadcrumbs, Wolfe was already drafting his list, not of theories, but of dinner guests. And I was in charge of the seating. You'd think that preparing for a murder-themed dinner party would be a rare occurrence in our brownstone. You'd be wrong. Wolfe has a fondness for cornering suspects over squab and sherry. He claims the digestive process disarms pretense. I arranged the chairs, one for Gerald Allerton, all blazer and entitlement, one for Dr. Finch, whose nervousness would no doubt arrive 15 minutes before he did, and one for Jeremy Moxley, assuming he could stay vertical long enough to form sentences. Wolfe's chair, naturally, remained where it always was, behind the desk, equidistant from reason and disdain. Fritz laid out the liquor with his usual care. I selected a single malt whisky that Wolfe wouldn't touch but which might loosen lips in others. The room smelled faintly of leather, old paper, and the unspoken promise of confrontation. When I brought Wolfe the final list, he examined it as if it were a seating chart for a tribunal. "No, Eleanor?" "Not tonight," I said. "She's being watched." "Watched?" he repeated. "By us," I said. "Soon." Wolfe didn't reply. He merely tapped his finger against the armrest. Slow, precise, and twice. A summons. The hunt had officially begun. Gerald Allerton arrived on time, wearing a jacket that cost more than some alibis, and a disposition borrowed from a bad temper. He declined Fritz's offer of wine and sat with the posture of a man prepared to win a lawsuit by sheer indignation. Wolfe didn't rise, he never does, but he inclined his head just enough to establish superiority. "Mr. Allerton, your acquaintance with Reginald Moxley was not untroubled." Allerton smiled thinly. "Trouble is relative, Mr. Wolfe. Reginald enjoyed creating it." "And you?" "I enjoyed observing it from a safe distance." That distance, it turned out, hadn't always been maintained. Allerton admitted, delicately of course, that Moxley had accused Claire Renner of financial opportunism. "A gold digger," he said, as if the term required translation. He claimed she had designs on his estate. Was she aware of his suspicion? "She was litigious," Allerton said, with the faintest curl of amusement. "And not easily deterred. I filed that under motive. Mutual." Wolfe, however, merely nodded. "And did you agree with his judgment?" "I agreed with his paranoia," Allerton said. "He was rarely wrong." That was a curious thing to say about a man lying dead of poison, but Allerton didn't strike me as fond of irony. Dr. Finch looked like a man who had forgotten something important and wasn't sure if it was medical or moral. He declined alcohol, sniffed his snuff twice in quick succession, and blinked when Wolfe addressed him by name. "You are aware," Wolfe began, "that both Mr. Moxley and Mrs. Renner were killed using an alkaloid derivative, likely aconitine." Finch cleared his throat. "Yes, that's what I was told." "You are a physician." "I am." "You possess access to medical compounds." Finch hesitated. "Controlled substances are kept under lock and key." Wolfe leaned back. "Monkshood, Dr. Finch, common name. Aconitum napellus, grows in New York, blooms late summer. Its toxicity is well documented. How would you prepare a lethal dose?" Finch flushed. "I wouldn't." "But could you?" He didn't answer. Wolfe pressed. "Do you grow monkshood?" "No." "But someone does." Finch blinked again. "It's rare, decorative, occasionally misidentified." I watched Wolfe's fingers drum once on the armrest. The tempo told me what I already suspected. Finch knew more than he was saying, possibly less than he feared, and fear in a man of medicine is either guilt or prognosis. Eleanor brought it in with both hands, as if weight could be assigned to menace. I took it and laid it flat across Wolfe's blotter. Cream paper, machine-typed, no signature. The usual anonymous civility. Blood calls to blood. The final hour arrives. Wolfe read it once, closed his eyes and said, "They are growing poetic." "It's the third," I said. "The rhythm's established. First Reginald, then Claire. Now—" He nodded. "Jeremy is presumed safe for the moment. That leaves Miss Moxley." She didn't flinch. I said, "Could be misdirection." "Possibly," Wolfe murmured. "But malice, when ritualized, tends toward structure." I asked Eleanor if she recognized the phrasing, family idioms, past correspondence, but she only shook her head. Wolfe didn't question further. He didn't need to. He just looked at the letter again, as if he could see not what it said, but where it had been written. Wolfe gestured for the trust document, an original from the Moxley file, yellowed and bracketed with annotations, and began to read aloud, softly, but with surgical clarity. Names, clauses, succession triggers. His voice was even, his diction exact. "Moxley, Claire Renner, Jeremy Moxley, Eleanor Moxley," he said, tapping each with a fingernail. "All listed beneficiaries, and all bound by survivorship." Meaning? If one dies, the estate is not redivided. The remainder accrues to the surviving heirs, a sequential harvest, so to speak. And if they all die? The estate passes, he said, to the designated alternate. Which is? He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back and closed the folder. I suspect, he said, that the name of that alternate is not currently public knowledge. But it may be of great interest to someone desperate. It wasn't the kind of thing you could prove in one stroke. But it was enough to make the killings look less like a spree and more like a design. And in Wolfe's world, design always has an architect. Wolfe is not fond of instructions, especially those that require practical effort from others. When he gives them, they arrive like monastic vows, absolute, unspoken, and draped in implication. That evening, he looked up from his brandy and said, "You will remain with Miss Moxley tonight." "That's a sentence, not a reason," I replied. "She may be next." I stood. "You're sure?" "Number, I'm convinced. A distinction worth maintaining." "Why me?" "You are competent. You are discreet. You are, alas, not easily poisoned." I saluted. He ignored it. Eleanor accepted the assignment with the kind of nod that doesn't bother to feign relief. She'd already begun to believe the letter. I packed light, a notebook, a shoulder holster, and a newspaper I wouldn't read. Wolfe added, as I reached the door, "Observe. Do not interfere unless compelled. If the killer moves tonight, I would prefer knowledge to interference." That's what I took with me. Along with the quiet knowledge that even Wolfe, in his chair of logic, had begun to feel the tension tighten. The hours ticked past with the slow dignity of insomnia. Eleanor slept, lightly, restlessly, while I sat in the dark beside the curtained window, counting radiator clicks and wondering if motive ever yawns. At exactly 3:07, I heard it. A soft scrape, then a rattle. Not wind, not accident. Back door, rear latch, tested. The knob turned and then stopped. A breath held, another attempt, deliberate, curious, quiet. I rose, silently, and drew my weapon, but no glass broke, no figure entered, just the retreating creak of a step. Then silence. I waited 10 minutes before moving. Whoever it was had no intention of forcing fate. Not yet. But they had come to check, to measure. And in the world Wolfe had charted, that meant the killer was keeping count. It was just past noon, and Wolfe had finished both his lunch and his grievances for the day. The trout was overcooked, it wasn't, and the newspaper had failed to distinguish between stupidity and evil in a political editorial. I waited until he'd pushed back from the table and moved to his desk before nudging the subject. "What we have," he said, "is not a sequence of murders born from passion or vengeance. It is arithmetic." "Arithmetic," I repeated, taking my seat. "Yes, deaths ordered by succession. Remove one heir and the remaining shares increase. Remove two and the pattern sharpens. And three?" He folded his hands. "Three suggests design." That was Wolfe's polite way of saying someone was cleaning house, but with a legal dictionary and a bottle of aconite. "The estate is not being targeted," he went on. "The estate is being refined." I leaned back. "You're saying the killer wants the money but doesn't want to inherit it? At least not directly." "Precisely." And in Wolfe's world, that meant only one thing. Someone had rewritten the rules of murder using an accountant's pen. The name emerged from the trust archive like a worm from a well-aged apple. Samuel Moxley, born 1896, removed from the line of inheritance by court petition in 1933, noted as mentally unsound. No further annotations, no death certificate. Wolfe raised one eyebrow and murmured, "Conveniently lost men are seldom truly gone." The file was brittle, typed on onion skin with the kind of ink that looked like it had been applied by candlelight. I flipped through it slowly, and there he was, listed as Reginald's half-brother. Disinherited, declared incompetent. Sent, presumably, somewhere quiet. "He had no offspring," I said. "None recorded," Wolfe corrected. "And I trust you've learned the difference." It was rare for Wolfe to show interest in the abstract, but something about Samuel, the timing, the silence, had him sharpening his metaphors. "Find him," he said. "That might take time." "Then use time. It is the one currency this killer appears to be spending." I tucked the page back into the file and headed for the coat rack. Ghosts don't usually leave footprints, but I had a feeling this one had bought new shoes. Jeremy remembered him clearly, but a man who didn't belong. Pale suit, crooked smile, asked too many questions and answered too few. Said his name was Simon Marks, claimed to be writing a book on Anglo-American estates, sat in the Oxford Club lounge for hours, reading nothing and watching everyone. "He spoke to me about my uncle," Jeremy said, but only vaguely. More interested in the family history than the man. "And he used his real name?" I asked. Jeremy hesitated. I assumed so. When I brought the name back to Wolfe, he didn't bother with sarcasm. "There is no Simon Marks," I reported. "Not on the club roster, not in city records, not in the British Genealogical Index. No passport, no address." Wolfe didn't frown, and he never did. But his fingers curled slightly against the armrest like a man anticipating a revelation. "Then we must ask," he said. "Who benefits from being seen without being known?" I nodded. "That's our man?" "No, Mr. Goodwin. That is our mask. We must now find the face behind it." There's a peculiar chill to walking into forgotten history, especially when the dust on the files is older than the secretary who hands them over. I started in Albany, estate records, sanitarium logs, military discharges. After 3 hours I found a trace. Samuel Moxley had once been assigned a guardian who had signed a transfer of property to a private holding company in 1942. The paper trail led to a small town upstate where property taxes still arrived, paid annually, on time, from a bank account opened under the name Morgan S. Marr. The address was a shuttered house with a plaque that said Hillgate Estate, no trespassing, and an old gate rusted half open. The locals remembered Mr. Morgan, a quiet recluse who received parcels, never visitors, and whose groceries were delivered weekly to a hatch at the back. I found the caretaker, a wiry man named Ernie Bell, who had opinions on everything except his employer. But when I mentioned Samuel Moxley, he froze like someone had recited a dead man's favorite joke. "He don't go by that name," Ernie said. "Not anymore." Which meant, of course, he still existed, and someone had gone to great lengths to keep it that way. Ernie Bell was the kind of man who wore his secrets like a raincoat, heavy but not shedding a drop. Still, he opened up once I'd bought him a cup of coffee and listened through 15 minutes of complaints about zoning boards, tax hikes, and the decline of milk delivery. "Mr. Morgan," he said, "wasn't mean, just quiet. Polite as a sermon, kept to himself, read a lot, didn't like noise." "You ever talk about family?" Ernie shook his head. "Only once. Said his brother had made something of himself. That was it. But he got letters, typed, never mailed." "Visitors?" "None, except the nurse during the war years and one fella last winter, strange type, said he was from a botanical institute." I didn't blink. "Interested in anything specific?" "Poison plants," Ernie said. "He asked about aconite. Said Mr. Morgan was a student of toxicity." I left Ernie with a few bills and a handshake. Wolfe wasn't going to like it, but he was going to believe it. Ghosts don't study monkshood, living men do. I got back to the brownstone with dirt on my shoes and just enough in my pocket to make Wolfe sharpen his gaze. I handed him the sketchiest kind of lead, a tax ledger, a pseudonym, a witness with a memory like cracked china, and a name, Morgan S. Marr, that no one could place but which had the unmistakable odor of effort. Wolfe didn't interrupt. He simply gestured for the documents, flipped through them once and said, "An alias with an income, a past with no present, and a history that has not expired. Yes, Mr. Goodwin, we are very close." He began laying the facts out in front of him, literal and metaphorical. Marks appears, Renner dies, Finch dodges, Jeremy folds, Samuel surfaces. He looked up. "The question is not whether Samuel Moxley lives. The question is, Has he already entered the game? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Wolfe wasn't finished yet. He tapped the desk once. And if so? From which side? I stepped into the office and found Kramer already in Wolfe's chair. Not sitting, of course. That would have constituted sacrilege. But looming over it, hands on hips, face like a granite accusation. "Where's Wolfe?" he barked. "Upstairs," I said, feeding orchids and resentment. "Get him." That wasn't necessary. Wolfe entered a moment later, wiping his hands with a silk cloth and smelling faintly of vanilla root and moral superiority. Kramer didn't wait. "Finch is gone." Wolfe's eyebrow lifted. "Gone?" "Vanished. Didn't show up for work. Apartment empty. Left everything behind but the dust." "Which implies haste," Wolfe murmured. "Or a ride in someone else's trunk," Kramer said. "I don't like this, Wolfe." "Nor do I," Wolfe said. "But I rather suspect it was inevitable." Kramer stared at him. "You think he ran?" "No," Wolfe replied. "I think he was removed. Quietly, efficiently, by someone accustomed to pruning unnecessary growth." I glanced at the empty chair in front of Wolfe's desk. It had been Finch's just yesterday. Now it was another vacancy, and vacancies in this case were starting to look like a message. It was just past 10 when Wolfe committed his first act of physical rebellion against inertia. He stood up, walked to the globe in the corner of the office, not to spin it, just to look at it, and said, "I shall require the car." That sentence, in our establishment, might as well have triggered a church bell or an air raid siren. Wolfe, leaving the house voluntarily, was rare enough to warrant a front-page headline and a change in barometric pressure. "The Oxford Club," he added, as if that clarified things. I blinked. "You're going there, personally?" He nodded. "The point has come when conjecture must meet setting." "You want to inspect Finch's quarters?" Number Y wished to inspect his absences. And that, I knew, was the difference. Wolfe didn't visit crime scenes. He visited omissions. When the facts stopped forming a pattern, he preferred to walk the gaps. I went to get the car keys, wondering whether the club's imported carpets were ready for 280 pounds of Montenegrin curiosity wrapped in grey silk. Finch's quarters at the Oxford Club had once aspired to order, but someone had since rearranged the ambition. Books were toppled, drawers yawned, and a teacup lay on its side like a discarded alibi. Wolfe surveyed the room with an expression halfway between disdain and pity. "Not a robbery," he said. "A search." I nodded. "Targeted. Someone knew what they wanted." And they'd found it. The shelf that had once held Finch's antique medical texts, including Thuringer's treatise on botanical toxins, now held nothing but dust outlines. One locked drawer had been jimmied, its contents unknown, though Finch had reportedly kept a few rare compounds for educational display. Wolfe leaned close to the shelf, sniffed, and nodded. "Camphor, but faint." "Meaning?" "Meaning," he said, "that someone extracted something volatile. And not recently." He turned to me. "The evidence of intelligence lies not in what was taken, Mr. Goodwin, but in what was not destroyed." Which, coming from Wolfe, meant someone had left him a trail, probably by accident. And in this case, that might prove fatal. Back in the car, Wolfe sat so still he might have been meditating, if you can imagine a man built like a mahogany wardrobe contemplating the universe. His lips moved, not in speech, but in something quieter, thought. Then, as we reached 35th Street, he said, "Finch manufactured the compound." "Not used it?" I asked. "Not necessarily. His fingerprints are on the method, not the moment." He tapped the window once. The elegance of the dose, the delayed onset. Finch knew the materials, but not the motive. "That's a guess." "No, Mr. Goodwin, that's a separation." I nodded. Wolfe's theory, never casually offered, was this. Finch might have brewed the poison, but someone else had chosen the cup. That meant accomplice, or manipulation, or both. And the worst part? If Wolfe was right, then the man who knew too much about monkshood might have already been scheduled to test its effects, involuntarily. The trail of Simon Marks, ghost, imposter, conversationalist, led me to Greenwich Village, where ghosts were thick and the rent was thin. The address he'd once scribbled on a matchbook, according to a half-reliable barmaid, turned out to be a shuttered bookstore tucked between a pawnshop and a place that served coffee with poetry. The shop, called Lyric Leaves, had been closed for at least a year, but the glass still bore the faint imprint of an open sign, reversed and sad. I didn't expect much, so I was surprised when the door, though locked, gave under pressure and led me into a world of dust and damp paper. No lights, no welcome, but something caught my eye. A satchel behind the counter, half-zipped, with papers spilling like forgotten confessions. Inside were correspondence fragments, typed, unsigned, and a receipt for a library card in the name Morgan S. Marr. That name rang familiar. Wolfe had said it once, softly, as if afraid it might answer. And now it had surfaced, with Simon Mark's ghost whispering through carbon copies and a silence thick enough to trip over. The back room held less dust and more memory. A ledger, battered and foxed, sat open on a desk like it had waited for a reader who never arrived. I flipped through it with fingers I kept dry. Some books have moods. Midway through, the name appeared, Samuel Moxley, born May 8th, 1896. Parents, Richard and Evelyn. Notations, private tutoring, institutional review, 1932, no death record, no Simon Marks, no Morgan Marr, but the handwriting, careful, practiced, and precise, matched the letters in the satchel. The man had kept 2 identities and left no fingerprints. But he'd left ink, and that was Wolfe's kind of scent. I copied the details into my pocketbook and locked the place behind me, such as it was. Whatever ghost had lived here had vacated, but not without leaving its bones. Wolfe always said, "The dead lie still. The vanished do not." I had just met a vanished man with a library card and a habit of watching heirs die in order, and now Wolfe would meet him too, or at least his ghost. We'd just finished reviewing the satchel when the phone rang, sharp and final. Fritz handed it to Wolfe with the face of a man who didn't want to. Wolfe listened, said nothing, hung up, then turned to me. "Finch is dead." I blinked. "How?" "Alley near the East River. No witnesses. Throat slit. Declared a suicide." "That's an interesting technique." "Indeed. The coroner must believe in acrobatics." Wolfe rose, not quickly, but not slowly, and moved to the window, which was how he paced. "Finch was a liability," he said. He knew the composition of the poison, but not its intention. That made him expendable. I asked, "So he didn't confess?" "Only by dying." The weight of that sentence didn't land hard, but it landed deep. Finch, the trembling doctor with too much knowledge and not enough courage, had followed Moxley and Renner into silence. Only his had been more precise, less poetic. Wolfe sat back down and said, "The killer is accelerating." That implies confidence or desperation. Either one, I knew, would make him more dangerous. But Wolfe wasn't blinking. He was calculating. It was after midnight when Wolfe finally emerged from the plant rooms, smelling faintly of moss and menthol, and took his place at his desk as if the world had held its breath waiting. I poured a glass of beer. He didn't ask for it. "You recall the photograph Eleanor showed us?" he said. "The one of her uncle, taken in London?" "Yeah, garden party. Blue hydrangeas, I remember." "Indeed, but it wasn't the flowers, it was the woman beside him. Hairline, shoulders, bone structure, a match to the portrait on the mantel in Moxley's study." I waited. "That was the real Eleanor Moxley," he said. I blinked. "You're saying, 'The woman who came to us is not his niece'?" I said nothing. Wolfe didn't gloat, he simply reclined. "She is an actress, Annabel Grant, moderate talent, better nerves, hired to impersonate a woman already dead." "And the motive?" Wolfe looked at me. "To generate urgency, to draw us in." And it worked. Of course it did, he said, because murder isn't always committed with poison. Sometimes it uses persuasion. There's a certain tone Wolfe uses when he's planning to enjoy himself at someone else's expense. It's formal, faintly bored, and contains the same thrill you'd hear in a cat's purr right before it strikes. That tone was present when he instructed Fritz to prepare duck à l'orange for 7, a dish Wolfe reserves for guests he intends to either ruin or recruit. At 7:30 sharp, the dining room filled like a trap, snapping shut. Gerald Allerton took the chair nearest the decanter and furthest from the host. Jeremy Moxley, pale and twice as stiff as the Riesling, sat opposite Annabel Grant, or Eleanor, if one still preferred stage names over signatures. And just beside me, providing the moral ballast of the evening, sat Inspector Kramer, who looked as if he'd been invited to a picnic and handed a subpoena. Wolfe presided with an expression of serene disgust. He hadn't left the house, after all, to let others fumble conclusions. As Fritz poured wine and the duck was carved, Wolfe cleared his throat with imperial intent, the signal that dessert might arrive with an arrest warrant. The only question was who would still be hungry after the first course. Wolfe never raised his voice when unmasking someone. He did it gently, like removing a silk veil from a statue that's already cracking. "Miss Grant," he began, eyes fixed on the woman carving her duck with dainty precision, "you are not Eleanor Moxley." A pause fell over the table like a dropped napkin. She looked up. "I'm sorry?" Wolfe tilted his head. "Annabel Grant, graduate of the Radley Institute for Dramatic Expression, 1 season at the Northampton Playhouse, 3 roles in regional productions, 1 as a grieving niece, satisfactory diction, weak memory." Jeremy choked on a mouthful of Riesling. Allerton merely narrowed his eyes. Kramer leaned forward. "You saying she was hired?" "Hired and coached," Wolfe confirmed, "to impersonate a woman who, regrettably, died 4 months ago in a sanitarium outside Bath." I noted the twitch in Jeremy's fingers. Annabel set down her fork. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "Not everything, just what I was told." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured. "And what you were told," he added, "was only what someone else wanted me to believe." The duck, now cold, had nothing on the temperature in that room. "The notes," Wolfe said, "were not warnings." "They were invitations." Jeremy blinked. "Invitations?" "Carefully tailored," Wolfe continued, "to compel my involvement. They mimicked the cadence of anonymous threat, but bore the fingerprints of theatrical flourish, capitalization for emphasis, an artificial rhythm. They were not meant to terrify, they were designed to attract attention." He glanced at Kramer, who grunted. "You saying someone baited you?" Wolfe nodded. "And you, Inspector, with calculated ambiguity. A murder is one thing, a pattern of inheritances disrupted by cryptic letters? That has the scent of mythology. And I detest mythology." Annabel looked pale. Jeremy stared at his untouched duck. Wolfe's fingers steepled. The play, as always, was never the message. It was the curtain. And the author of these missives wanted the audience fixed on shadows, while the real motive unfolded quietly, just beneath the proscenium. Allerton raised an eyebrow. Wolfe saw it, and returned a smile thin as piano wire. "Which brings us," he said, "to Dr. Finch." "Dr. Finch," Wolfe continued, "discovered more than he was supposed to." He didn't look at anyone in particular when he said it, which made it all the more chilling. "He knew the compound," Wolfe said. "He identified its botanical origin, but he also identified the context in which it had been prepared, a context only accessible to one member of the Oxford Club's inner circle." Jeremy swallowed. "You're saying he knew who?" "Yes," Wolfe replied simply. "And he died for that knowledge. Suicide was an invention, a fiction invented by the very hand he threatened to expose." Annabel looked down at her plate. Kramer leaned back. "You have a name?" "I do," Wolfe said. "But first, I must introduce the man who does not exist." which, considering the company at the table, was less surprising than it ought to have been. The only person not visibly reacting was Allerton, but then again I've seen better poker faces on department store mannequins. "Simon Marks," Wolfe declared, "is a fiction." He turned his head almost lazily toward Allerton. "Invented for convenience and for proximity." Allerton smiled thinly. "You're suggesting I—" "Yes," Wolfe said. "I am suggesting precisely that. You, Mr. Allerton, posed as Simon Marks to insert yourself into club conversation. Your familiarity with the Moxley name was not accidental, it was inherited." Jeremy bristled. "Inherited?" Kramer cut in. "You're telling me this guy's a Moxley?" "Not biologically," Wolfe said, "but legally. Through the 5th clause of the 1911 Estate Trust, the one permitting inclusion by petition under the name Marks. A loophole Samuel Moxley exploited and Mr. Allerton helped him defend." Allerton's lips parted. "That's conjecture." "No," Wolfe said, "it's arithmetic. I traced the club guest logs. I traced the snuff case engraved with your initials, left at the bookshop where Mr. Marr, alias Samuel, used to meet you." Kramer stood. I stood. Jeremy stood late. Allerton did not. He only looked down at his napkin and folded it very slowly, like he was preparing for the next course, but not of duck. Wolfe had set his fork aside and was now fully in lecture mode, which meant the evening was either approaching triumph or catastrophe. "In the club's guest log," he said, "Mr. Allerton signed in twice during the nights preceding each death, including the night of the fire." Kramer's eyes narrowed. "Furthermore," Wolfe continued, "the snuff case found in the bookshop bore traces of aconitine, not uncommon in herbal tinctures, but concentrated enough to be suspicious." "Circumstantial," Allerton muttered. Wolfe's voice sharpened. "As is your unverified trip to London, you claim to visit the British Library, yet no visa, no ticket stub, no record of departure." Jeremy looked like he was watching a chessboard collapse. Wolfe stood, to reach a paper on the credenza. "And lastly, handwriting analysis places your script squarely within the authorial range of the notes." Kramer nodded once. I saw it then, a flicker of something in Allerton's eyes. Not panic. Something quieter. Despair. Which, in Wolfe's vocabulary, was the final confirmation. He returned to his seat as dessert arrived. Mousse with a garnish of revelation. There's a moment when a man knows the net has closed that you can see it in his posture. Allerton's had shifted, no longer poised, no longer defiant. He stared at his plate like it might offer retreat. Wolfe, enjoying a spoonful of chocolate mousse, remarked, "Confession is no longer required. Circumstance has already spoken." That was when Allerton moved. Fast, not for a man of literature and lawsuits. He lunged, not at Wolfe, which might have been reasonable, but at Jeremy Moxley, who had the misfortune of being young, unarmed, and possibly next on the list. Fortunately for Jeremy, I still had reflexes, and the Persian rug had less grip than my arms. I intercepted Allerton mid-charge, wrapped him up with enough professional grace to spare the furniture, and dropped him squarely beside the sherry cart. Kramer helped himself to cuffs. Wolfe didn't flinch. "Mr. Goodwin," he said calmly, "would you kindly remove the mousse from that man's collar before Fritz sees it?" I did. The mousse was good. The motive had been better, but the aftermath, as always, would require its own digestion. There's a peculiar quality to a confession delivered not in defeat, but as if it were a toast. Gerald Allerton, wrists slightly trembling, but voice smooth as melted pewter, stared across the table at Wolfe and offered the truth like a vintage wine just now reaching the palate. "Yes," he said, "I wrote the letters, I orchestrated the impersonation, and I procured the compound, though I did not, I emphasize, administer it." Wolfe, not blinking, replied, "You emphasize what cannot exculpate." Kramer muttered something under his breath that wasn't Latin but got the point across. Allerton exhaled. The Moxleys squandered their name, drunks, lunatics, philanderers, all allowed to thrive, while Samuel, the one with a mind, was discarded. I sought only to restore the name through clarity, remove the contaminated strands. Inheritance by eradication, Wolfe said coolly. A philosopher's crime. Useless without conscience and fatal with it. The silence that followed was broken only by the scrape of Allerton's chair as he stood, uninvited, and looked briefly at Jeremy. I gave you a future. No, Jeremy said. You gave me a nightmare I'll have to forget. Wolfe lifted one eyebrow. If you can. Kramer's way with handcuffs isn't delicate, and Allerton received no preferential treatment. He didn't resist, just stood there, oddly upright, as if still giving a lecture to a dwindling class. Come on, Kramer growled. You can preach justice to the night shift. Allerton glanced at Wolfe. You are, in your way, a monster. Wolfe inclined his head. In my way, yes. But I prefer orchids to corpses. They were halfway to the front door when Kramer turned to me. This one was like gardening with dynamite. Next time he starts sniffing botanicals, call me before someone ends up face down in a park. You were on the list, I said. Number 4. Right between the wine merchant and the violinist. Kramer snorted. He makes it sound like a game. It's never a game, I said. Just a board nobody else sees. That earned me a grunt, and they were gone. Back in the dining room, Wolfe was already reaching for the Burgundy. His fingers were calm, but something behind his eyes hadn't yet returned to rest. The roast duck had cooled, but Wolfe, now content with solitude and sauce, seemed to be conducting a post-mortem, not of Allerton, but of the affair itself. A melodrama in tweed, he murmured, inspecting the rim of his Burgundy glass. Too much artifice, too little necessity. I leaned against the sideboard. So you're unimpressed? Hardly, he said, but I do not admire cleverness that serves madness. It squanders itself. I watched him for a moment. There was something in the way he swirled the wine, not distracted, but contemplative, as if judging the vintage of murder rather than of grapes. You'll write this one up? I asked. No. He sipped. It lacks nutritional value, like a meal with no salt. Technically complete, but uninspired. And with that, he reached for another bite of duck and dismissed the whole thing with a chew. There's something about Wolfe. He can solve a murder and critique its presentation in the same breath. Jeremy Moxley didn't linger. He'd stayed long enough to watch the man who'd tried to rewrite his bloodline get packed into a squad car, but beyond that, he had no appetite for resolution. He came by the next afternoon with a thin envelope and a thinner smile. Just to say thank you, he muttered, pushing it into my hand. For not letting it be me. I offered him coffee. He declined. I offered him questions. He dodged. Wolfe, upstairs with his orchids, left no instructions which I interpreted as permission not to press. Some ghosts do better untethered. Where will you go? I asked. He shrugged. Someplace where my name doesn't start conversations. I watched him walk out and disappear into the late-day traffic. Not hurried, not fleeing, just evaporating like a fog the sun finally noticed. That's the thing about innocence. When it survives, it doesn't always stay grateful. Sometimes it just leaves. Wolfe would have approved. I went back inside, already suspecting he was preparing to disapprove of something else. It wasn't tactically sound, but curiosity got the better of me. Late that evening, after Fritz had withdrawn with his soup pots and the brownstone had resumed its nocturnal hush, I asked him, "Do you regret not taking the case when the first letter arrived?" Wolfe, in his chair, eyes half closed, responded with a sound somewhere between a breath and a sermon. "Regret," he said, "is for men who believe time is theirs to command. I do not." "You mean you don't feel regret, or you don't believe in it?" He opened his eyes. "Both. To regret a decision is to presume an alternate reality in which one's foresight is flawless, That is vanity, not wisdom. I nodded slowly. But still, if we'd acted sooner— Mr. Goodwin, he interrupted, voice low but unmistakably final. We act when the facts compel us, not when emotion titillates us. I let that one settle. He closed his eyes again. Now, if you please, silence. The orchids are sleeping. And so was he, or near enough. Some men dream of justice. Wolfe prefers logic. And if logic occasionally arrives late, it at least never lies about why. I found him the next morning in the plant rooms, sleeves rolled to his forearms, hands deep in the loam beside a young orchid, pale-stemmed, cobalt-hooded, strangely delicate. New addition? I asked. He didn't look up. Aconitum napellus. I blinked. Monkshood. He nodded. Yes. The same genus as the compound that killed Finch? Yes, he said again, and delicately pressed soil around the roots. Bit morbid, isn't it? I said. Tending the flower that figured in the crime? Wolfe turned to me, the light through the glass making his face look both tired and oddly serene. On the contrary, it is a reminder that beauty and peril share a stem. Sentimental for you. Not sentiment, he murmured. Structure. This one, unlike the others, grows in symmetry even while hiding venom. It understands itself. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. He bent lower, misting the bloom with an atomizer, almost like a benediction. I left him there, among the orchids, where poison could be potted, named, and no longer denied. Evening had returned, subdued and amber-lit, and I was just hanging my coat when Wolfe, behind me in the office, spoke as if he'd been thinking through a novel-length paragraph and had finally reached the period. In the end, he said, murder is like a fine tea, bitter, masked by sugar and always served hot. I turned. That mean you're ready for a cup? No, he said. It means I've finished thinking about this one. He pushed back in his chair with a sigh that might have been mistaken for satisfaction if you didn't know the man. What are you working on now? I asked. He tapped a closed volume of Browning. Rehabilitation of verse. After weeks of homicidal egotists, I require meter and restraint. I smiled. And no tea. He gave a grunt. Not agreement, but toleration, and closed his eyes. I watched him for a moment, the last word echoing. Always served hot, which, in Wolfe's view, was the only temperature justice ever truly deserved, and with that I turned out the light. Justice, in this affair, came not with fanfare, but with a sigh, tucked between a clipped confession and the silence that follows names unspoken too long. A man mistook legacy for birthright, and bitterness for duty, dressing his vengeance in eloquence and carefully measured drops. Yet in Wolfe's study, amid orchids and roasted duck, the truth peeled itself open with the slow certainty of logic uncoiled. But tell me, when family becomes fiction and fiction becomes motive, where does morality land its final blow? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.